were the Jewish revolutionaries in Munich? Were they extremely prominent in the revolution, or is that just a perception that they were? And did their quote unquote prominent role engender increased anti-Semitism at the time?
So I argue that I think there was no other revolution in Europe where Jews were as prominent as in Munich in 1918 and 19. The revolution had a few different parts. There was the revolution I mentioned in 1919, and just to chronologically to get it background right, Eisner was prime minister until February of 1919, when he actually was on his way to resign because his party had lost in the elections, and he was shot. He was assassinated on his way to resign. And after that followed some period of political chaos, including two Soviet republics. That sounds very Russian, but it's just a translation of, actually, we should call it council republics, because a Soviet is a council. The first one was not communist, not oriented towards Moscow. The second one was. The leaders of all of those short-lived council republics were all Jewish, the most important leaders. And some of them were already associates of Eisner, like Gustav Landauer. Now, Gustav Landauer was the most Jewish of them. He was very much engaged. First of all, he was an important intellectual in Germany at the time, a translator, a writer, and his political view was more like an anarchist than anything else. But he became a leading proponent of the Eisner's revolution, then of the Council of Republics. Eisner was very interested in Zionism. He was very interested in East European Jews, and he was he had Jewish knowledge as well. So he was one of them. But there were others, writers. Many of them were poets and writers, like Erich Mühsam, Ernst Toller, quite prominent, some of them later in life as writers. And all of them somehow stood by their Jewishness as secular Jews, of course, but never denying it. And that, I think, is very interesting if we compare it to another revolution that had Jewish protagonists, like in Hungary under Bela Kun, or, as I said before, Trotsky or Luxemburg. These were figures who, in a way, were also fascinated by some parts of their Jewish heritage, especially the prophets, which they always recalled. And I think the most powerful scene to illustrate this is the moment of Kurt Eisner's burial in February of 1919, a few days after he was assassinated. It was actually the largest procession through the streets of Munich. Munich had seen so far. About 100,000 people were on the streets. And the main speech, the main eulogy, was delivered by his close friend, Gustav Landauer. So there was one Jew eulogizing another Jew who was prime minister of Bavaria. And what he said in his speech is, Kurt Eisner, the Jew, very interesting to mention that, and recalled how close he was to the heritage of the biblical prophets.
And because of this prominent role, did that engender an increase in anti-Semitism? And how did that anti-Semitism manifest itself?
Yes, I argue in the book that we shouldn't oversimplify it. I wouldn't say that anti-Semitism existed because of the role of prominent Jews in these revolutions, but it was definitely used by anti-Semites, and very explicitly by Hitler. Now, that's one of the, of course, moments where why we think Munich might be a little more important at that moment than many other cities, because that was the place where Adolf Hitler witnessed the revolutionary events. He came back after the war to the city he had moved to before the war, namely Munich, and he witnessed many of those revolutionary events. And he later wrote in Mein Kampf that made him a politician, and that turned him, into the person with the political views he had. If that is correct, we don't know. That's what he later claimed, but it's interesting, even that's what he claimed later. So yes, definitely, it was used by those who may have been anti-Semites anyway to strengthen their arguments against socialism, because those few Jews who happened to be in leadership roles happened to be also socialists at this part. And we are in a Germany that does not want to concede or to admit that Germany could have lost the war on the battleground. They developed a legend called the stab in the back legend. So Germany was basically stabbed in the back by their own people, namely Jews and socialists. Now, if you were Jewish and socialist, you can imagine with this increasing mood of blaming and finding scapegoats within Germany, namely Jews and socialists, it was not easy for them.